I had made it my lifetime's ambition to capture this nightmarish scene upon my canvas, for I am an artist, of sorts. I never seemed to quite seize the true essence of that last final moment. Something was missing, either from my conscious or unconscious mind, and I charged myself with the duty to discover that missing spark of clarity. This brings me to my true motive for buying the house. It would serve as my muse, my conduit to those bygone days of old Bartontown. Within those rotting beams and creaking sagging roof, I would live in isolation, channeling the old magic whilst I painted my masterpiece, and once and for all unravel the mystery surrounding what I grew to believe was my impending preordained death. I decided early on that I would do very little, if any, renovation to the house. I needed it to stand in its perfect decomposing glory if it was indeed going to enlighten me to the extent required to spark my imagination into painting my crowning achievement. After signing the necessary paperwork, I still had business to attend to in Manchester, so painfully I had to leave Barton behind for a week or so to sort out these pressing affairs. I left a solicitor, Mr. Fisher, with a small list of work I wanted him to organize concerning the house in my absence, and he was happy enough to do so. The house had no electricity, but I was more than happy with gaslight, so this needed to be looked into. Running water was a necessity, as were new doors and locks. A few of the windows needed replacing too. But I made it clear to him that I wanted as much of the original glass preserved as possible, so only those windows that had fallen into irreversible repair were to be replaced. Mr. Fisher advised me that the land around the house was also in need of some attention. The feeble wooden fence surrounding the main house had fallen in many places, and the gardens were so overgrown that you could barely see the difference between them and the woodland beyond, but I insisted on keeping these undisturbed. The meager appointments that kept me away from my beloved house began to wear away at my patience, and the longing to be at the house, and my separation from it, grew to the point of impossible madness. I worked feverishly to settle all my affairs in Manchester, and managed to return to Barton a few days ahead of schedule. I dropped in to see Mr. Fisher, and he assured me that all the work I requested had been done, and with that I signed the last bit of necessary paperwork, took the keys, and made my way straight to Gunner's Clough with a reserved, hidden joy. There were two main ways to access the house. The first was a feeble back path that branched out from Elmwood Road and eventually degenerated into an overgrown woodland byway that nobody used. This path would bring me out at the bottom of a small bank, through which a fern-choked stream cut lazily through the woods. From the bank, some rough stone steps, slick, green, and fungus-ridden, would lead haphazardly upwards and to the back garden of my new home. The second method of entry was quicker and by far my more preferred. This path cut through the cemetery of Barton Parish and led to the Gunner's Clough at the back. This path would lead me through the trees, and after a decent walkthrough would bring me to the front of the house, and so it became my preferred journey. The towering wych elms greeted me as I reached the far end of the graveyard and into Gunner's Clough proper. The autumn sun disappeared quickly as the tangled and gnarled canopy strangled out the rays of light, and in very little time, all was dark and muted. I must re-emphasize the latter, because it was unearthly silent in the woodland. No birds or insects agitated me with their incessant twitter or buzzing as I traveled deeper into the trees, and I developed a half-fancy in my mind that the creatures of Gunner's Clough were showing respectful silence, for a new master had arrived and adoration must be shown. Then, abruptly, and with the rekindled, but welcomed terror of childhood fantasies, the house came into view. I increased my step, not from fear of the dark trees or the eerie forest quiet, but from pure, distilled excitement. The house stood before me. I dropped my bags in awe, just as I had done when I first saw the Titanic terror as a child, and gaped, slack-jawed at the majesty and beauty of the structure that stood before me. The windows had been fixed, but there was enough of the original smoky glass left that the repairs were barely noticeable. Like everything else in the immediate vicinity, these had been engulfed by the aura of dread the house emitted. I cannot say for how long I stood there, in hushed ecstasy, but eventually I regained my sense of self and snapped out of the hypnosis, taking my bags to the front door. The large iron key provided by Mr. Fisher slotted into the lock with a fantastic and sinking clunk, and I turned it laboriously, slowly, and deliberately in order to savor the sights and smells of what lay beyond the threshold. There was little sound. I expected a creak from the door, but it swung open smoothly, silently. I walked forward and fully drank in the gloomy scene. There was enough light reaching through the windows to permit me to see, but not in great detail. This I greatly enjoyed, as it allowed me to conjure up whatever imagined phantoms I desired. I half danced through the hall and into the lounge, to the kitchen and the empty rooms beyond whose original purpose was lost on me. My mind was in a haze of delight as every childhood horror and imagined terror played out before me like a grand play. Fanaticized noises and sights spewed forth from the depths of my subconscious, and for a moment I was in Tartarus itself. There was one detail, however, that was not fantasy, and that was the overpowering musk of decay that assaulted my nostrils and brought me once again back to the physical plane. It was a charnel smell, at once sweet and sickly. It was the scent of death, and it was everywhere. I concluded, erroneously, that an animal must have crawled into the house and died, leaving its rotting carcass concealed somewhere beneath the floorboards or in the attic above. I searched at once for the source of the sepulchre fragrance, but to no avail. There was no sign of a dead animal anywhere, not downstairs, not in the bedrooms above or the small, cramped attic overseeing the whole rotting affair. The investigation into the cause of the smell was not entirely fruitless, for it revealed to me fully the horrifying glory of the aforementioned attic space. For such a large house, the attic was tiny, the roof was so low that I had to stoop once inside, and to my dismay, it was barren and empty. I had hoped to find some relic from the house's past, but there was only dust and dry cobwebs. The entire structure felt wrong. The beams sloped at queer angles and created all manner of visual vicissitudes that caused my mind to spin. Areas of the roof bend inwards and then sharply outwards with no reason or rhyme. Small needless corners had been created from the beams for no apparent purpose. I felt like I stood trapped within some kind of impossible triacontahedron, a mental hall of mirrors that reflected all the unknown laws of the universe back upon themselves. I quickly concluded that the original builder had either been a genius or a lunatic. I made the decision on the spot right there. Here I would paint my masterpiece. Here I would sit in the shadows with the feeble light from the singular round window that loomed menacingly above me and vomit forth my magnum opus. Despite the banquet of horrors my brain had feasted upon since my arrival, I had no desire to start my painting just yet. Instead, I moved all my equipment into the attic, ready for when the black mood would take me. I retired downstairs for the evening. I had yet to buy a bed to sleep in, and the crumbling, rotting frame of what was left in the master bedroom was hardly fitting. I unpacked my cases and arranged the essentials, my painting tools, my coffee, which I immediately set to boil on the kitchen stove, and my cigarettes. I had brought some simple foodstuffs, cheese, bread, and cold-cooked meat, which I ate in my usual detached way. I resigned myself to an early night, equipping the dusty sofa with a sleeping bag I had bought in Manchester, and slowly welcomed the coming darkness. I had hoped that my first day in the house would inspire in me my usual nightmarish death scene, from which I would transmute paint to the canvas with untold dread in the morning. The dream, however, did not come. At least it did not come in the usual fashion I had come to expect. In its place, an all-new terror had shambled on to the mind's midnight stage, its curtains slowly opening as my eyes gradually closed. I found myself lost in a maze of earth-hewn tunnels, slick with niter and damp to the touch. I knew I had to be underground, but how far down, I could not tell. I had only a hand lamp for light, and I made my way along the twisting charnel corridor with no sense of purpose or reason, pressing forward into the waiting gloom. Gibbering sounds could be heard echoing all around me from an unknown direction, half barks, and half-hushed voices. I strained to make out the words they spoke. I could hear only a few scratching utterances, but what I could hear terrified me to my core. Small semi-comprehensive sentences such as "He has come, shall we feast?" and quiet, "He is listening." I saw shapes dart around just out of my radius of vision. Hideous canine countenances grinned at me with bestial craving. Semi-human eyes rolled loose in their sockets and mocked me from the shadows. I tried to run, but lost my footing, crashing to the floor. I expected to wake, as was typical in a dream when you fall, but I did not. My lamp shattered on the ground, and the light instantly disappeared, gobbled up by the hungry darkness. Then they came for me, dozens upon dozens of eyes, swollen and misshapen. I felt claws embrace me like iron vices, and in the blackness, I felt my body rise from the floor. My scene suddenly shifted. I now found myself in the attic, set in front of my canvas, straining to see what image lay upon it. A cacophony of crashing noises stampeded below me, growing closer and closer. I panicked, picking up a nearby brush and frantically tried to finish the piece I had started. Then slowly the hatch to the attic, a small square on the floor by my feet opened, revealing again those almost human eyes that looked upon me with ghoulish lust. I screamed and then awoke. The cold sweat chilled me as I stirred on the sofa. I looked around and half expected to see one of my fiendish adversaries waiting to pounce, but mercifully I was alone. Sunlight penetrated the lounge window, and I looked at my watch to see the morning had passed me by. It was 2:15 in the afternoon, and I had grossly overslept. Despite my uncharacteristic dozing, I did not feel refreshed in the least. In fact, I felt quite the opposite, and could have slept for much longer, had I been an undisciplined man. I made breakfast and went into the back garden where I lit a cigarette and strolled around in the brisk air, taking in the sights of the woodland beyond. Unlike my initial arrival, there was now activity among the creatures of Gunner's Clough, and all manner of beasts were happily singing, chirping, and croaking away. The noise was so loud, in fact, that I finished my cigarette quickly and went back into the house, pulling my collar up against the cold. I still felt no compulsion to paint and did not visit the attic at all that day. In fact, I actively avoided entering the place. My muscles were sore, a product of my poor sleeping conditions, and I wandered around the house from room to room like a lost soul searching for purpose. As I made a second trip around the ground floor rooms, I also noticed that the rotten smell I first encountered the day before was now gone. I cannot say I was not pleased about this. Perhaps a scavenger had visited during the night and taken the foul source away to its den to feast upon in safety. With the day drawing on and nothing to do but drink coffee and smoke, I decided instead to pack some sandwiches and spend what was left of the day in Barton Village. Barton had a small, humble library, and what it lacked in academic literature it made up for in local history and folklore. My area of search was, quite naturally, the house. With help from a hoary librarian who had served at the library for as long as I could remember, I was able to track down some scant information concerning the house in the woods and the family who had once laid claim to it from a small book entitled A Treaty of Demonic Influences in Cheshire, penned by an Eastwich author called Samuel Gaunt. I was able to find an obscure reference to a man called Jonathan Bickham who had once lived in the house, which was known simply as the house in Elmwood. Bickham, according to the librarian, was forced to flee Barton altogether some 120 years past when it became known that he was in possession of a small library of forbidden books that had, at the time, been banned by the church. The worst of these offenders had been titled Les Cultes des Ghouls, a tome not wholly unfamiliar to me. I had heard of this particular book whilst at university, and it was always mentioned in hushed whispers by unsavory types. I found the name of Bickham to be of special interest, for my own surname of Pickman was somewhat similar, having a common origin in the old Saxon tribe of Bicamy. Of the aforementioned ghoulish tome, I could find no further information other than the author being a Frenchman called the Comte de Lette. But I had a name of Bickham to go on, and I instead focused upon that line of investigation. With the few hours of sunlight remained me, I traced all reference to the Bickham family and their lineage. The family had both built and owned the house I now lived in for many generations, but had forsaken it several decades before I was born. These then must be the blighted bloodline that had laid claim to my beloved house and abandoned it, or instead faded into oblivion, leaving it behind. Of the fate of the Bickham line nothing could be found. It was suggested that the last scion of the family had died with no heir, but there were also references to a family of the same name leaving for New England many years ago. It seemed unlikely that I could ever piece together the ultimate fate of the family, but they didn't overly concern me. The house was mine now and would remain so forever. Row upon row of weathered headstones offered me a different sort of library, and I searched gleefully for the name of Bickham among the weathered gravestones. Confusingly, my search ended in disappointment, for not a single stone bore the name I feverishly sought. That not a single Bickham graced those lifeless cribs diffused me greatly, and I retired back to my house, defeated and sour. As I made my way along the darkening woodland path, I once again noticed the lack of animal sounds. This was no surprise, as I assumed most of the creatures who had participated in the morning's cacophony were diurnal and had likely retired, but still the silence was oppressive and followed me all the way back to my home. I lit the gas lamps in the lounge and drank in the somber surroundings I would once again be calling my bedroom for the night. The sun had now completely vanished from the sky, allowing the stars and moon to take the stage and perform their indifferent watch over the darkened earth. It had been my intention to pen a letter to a learned friend in Manchester concerning les cultes des ghouls, but as I took pen to paper, a wave of apathy took hold of me, and I suddenly found myself drowsy and languid. Once more, I found myself in the tunnels. This time the light was even dimmer as I gripped a half-dying candle, and not a lamp. The impression of being even further beneath the earth gripped me, and I wandered aimlessly in random directions, occasionally tripping over stray rocks and other debris whose hollow clicking and clattering sent a chill racing up my spine. The tunnel grew wider as I traveled and opened up before me in a large, almost square chamber lined with row upon row of long wooden coffins. The darkness hampered my investigation, but I could make out dozens of the horrid cradles, some open and scattered, others arranged haphazardly atop one another. For the first time in my history of nightmarish hallucinations, the reality of what I was seeing started to become apparent. This did not feel like a dream. As this realization overtook me, a voice whispered from behind and into my ear, its words mumbled and mercifully incomprehensible. As I felt that fetid breath upon the back of my neck, I was taken by the sensation of a sudden rising and found myself flung once more into the lonesome confines of the attic above. Again, I squatted in front of the canvas, straining to see what was painted upon it. The work appeared more complete than in my previous dream, and I noticed I was holding a brush in my right hand, whilst something cold and gelatinous lay clutched in the other. The face at the attic door gibbered once again, and as I looked down, I saw not one, but several sets of eyes through the thin gap. Several sets of huge, swollen spheres of mad jelly lay focused upon me, rolling around, unblinkingly in their dead, fleshy sockets. I did my best to ignore them and continued to paint. I strained greatly to actually see what I was painting, but the image was blurry and shifted unreasonably before my eyes. In one brief moment of clarity, I have fancied that I saw my own face looking back at me from the stained canvas. As this realization swept over me, and I started to panic, the smashing sounds below erupted once more, and the attic door swung open violently. My heart leapt into my throat, and I raised my arms defensively to try and beat away the swarms of clawed hands that grasped at me. I screamed into the void as a deeper darkness engulfed the attic and swallowed me whole. Morning came, and relieved, I awoke from the sofa, my heart racing. The usual ritual of coffee, cigarettes, and breakfast followed, but I felt more like a spectator watching these mundane events from a distance, as opposed to being actively involved in them. Once more, I failed to muster the energy to paint, but only this time I felt a shred of genuine fear when the thought of sitting in the attic with my canvas entered my mind. I scolded myself internally. Had this not been what I wanted, to feel terror and use it as a muse to help me create? But try as I might, I just could not start my painting and avoided the upper rooms of my house. Instead, I looked upon the makeshift writing desk where I had begun my letter the night before and decided to finish what I had started. In addition to asking my friend about Les Colt's day ghouls, I also asked if he could make use of the superb facilities of the Manchester Library and find out all and any information concerning the Bickham family of Cheshire. I would have left for Manchester myself, but I was loath to leave my house, lest I lose the aura of horror it has projected upon me, for no matter how much the fear would grip me. In the end, I was certain in my conviction that I could transform it into creativity. In the meantime, I would impose upon a nearby source of information that quite literally stood on my doorstep. Leaving my house, I walked towards the parish church in search of its priest in hopes that he may know why no Bickham rested in his cemetery. As luck would have it, I stumbled upon him just as I exited the woodland. He stood, with his back turned to me, slightly hunched over a headstone on the outskirts of the graveyard, and as I approached, I could see that it was curiously entangled with a matted net of lush green ivy that had snaked its way around a peculiar worn and weather-beaten headstone. I made no attempt to mask my presence as I didn't wish to startle him, for he seemed oblivious and lost in his work. He had in his hand a notepad, and on the floor nearby lay several old and large tomes, similar in character to those I had read at the Barton Library. I had to cough in that repugnant and obvious manner in order to gain his attention, which it did. I introduced myself quickly, and he likewise. Rev. Stephen Spencer was his name, and he did not seem keen to speak to me at all. I got straight to the point quickly and asked why, despite being a resident family for generations, there were no Bickham family buried on the grounds. In a detached and wholly disinterested manner, he replied quickly and simply. The Bickman family, he explained, had special permission from the council to inter their dead upon their property. There was, he guessed, a family tomb or crypt of some sorts in the Gunner's Clough, where the deceased Bickmans now lay. He did, however, warn that several years ago an incident of flooding had caused large sections of the woodland bank to collapse and erode, revealing long-buried caskets that may or may not belong to the family. With that, he went straight back to his ivy-shrouded headstone, and even when I thanked him for the information, he dismissed it with a wave of his hand in a clearly agitated manner. I crumpled up the letter and cast it aside, knowing now the full horror of what was in store for me. Smudges of paint on my hands confirmed what I had suspected. My painting was finished, created during the grip of that perverse somnambulism that had cursed me since I entered the house. Aided by the nighttime lords of Elmwood House, they who had once were the faces of the mortal Bickham bloodline. Now I sit in horrid semi-darkness, the flickering of dying candles my only source of light and warmth. I stare across the attic and upon the finished canvas and at the figures painted upon it. They almost come to life as my eyes adjust to the blackness. I can see hordes of white-fleshed naked corpses clambering and colliding into a pile of madness and cadaverous peaks, upon which I have painted myself sat atop. A slab of meat has been painted clutched in my hands, and a look of unbridled lust portrayed on my face. I can hear the horde below me, crashing and breaking through the house. They are coming for me, coming to welcome one of their own into the pack. This is how I will die. This is how I always knew I would die. Even though I now understand the horrid truth, one detail still eludes me. They are here to force upon me that last and final act that will secure my place in their immortal ranks for all time, until the stars die, and the old ones are free once more to roam the dark corners of man's domain. What I do not know, however, is this. When the end comes, and I look upon that lifeless flesh in my hands, will I lick my lips with glee as as the painting shows I will? Or will my weak and feeble body instead provide the feast for those hideous tenants who even now slowly open the door to the attic and who, since time immemorial, have lared beneath the elm wood house, the house in the woods, the house of dead gods?